Oslo over the last few years has been pushing for a rethinking of just how cities work. If you follow news about transportation or urbanism, you might have seen some headlines about how Oslo is aiming to transform its metro area in some big ways. Its policymakers want to make the city more resilient for the future and make it safer for its residents. This includes increasing public transportation usage, increasing bike usage, and decreasing the amount of cars on the roads and where those cars are allowed to be. Oslo's Vision Zero plan that started over 20 years ago aimed at making the city's center more people-friendly. Over that time period, Oslo has managed to reduce pedestrian and cyclist deaths to zero. This is a huge win compared to many US cities, where in some areas pedestrian deaths and injuries are increasing. One of the things that makes Oslo great is how accessible it is. It doesn't just have one of the most extensive metro systems for a city its size, but also a relatively intact pre-1950s tram system. When you combine these systems with its bus network and growing bike network, it makes you wonder why more cities aren't like Oslo. Cities in the US, Canada, Europe, and all over the world can learn an important lesson from Oslo and its policy choices. When you look at Oslo's history, its size, and the challenges it faces, you can argue that it has a lot in common with a lot of other car-centric places. Yet, it's taken the right steps, and now it's on a path to building better livability for its residents. This is Oslo's City Hall in the 1950s and 60s. The city had gone from 50 years of tram and train-centric growth to a sudden boom in car ownership, which caused congestion and pollution. This is that same space now. Even up until 20 years ago, this area still had a lot of cars, but now it's been turned into a tram and pedestrian-only zone. A lot of the most visible changes to Oslo in terms of car reduction is apparent near Oslo's fjord, its harbor. The government's Fjord City initiative has redeveloped the entire coastline of the city to be more accessible and people-focused. One area where this redevelopment is obvious is in the neighborhood adjacent to the city hall. This is where Oslo's world-famous opera house was built. Before that, though, it was a massive urban highway that was around since the 1950s. This area is the poster child of the Fjord City project. It was turned from an industrial area with a huge highway to a residential area with transit connections and tons of open space. The plan was put in place in 2003, and from then on, year after year, the city carved away at the highway, moved it into a tunnel, and built up the surrounding area, including running a new tram line through the main boulevard. The Fjord City project is still not done, but it aims to add thousands of new units of housing, new job centers, and a significant amount of public space accessible by multiple means of transportation. This change to the fabric of the city's waterfront took time and careful planning, and it highlights one of the big hurdles that cities have to deal with when pushing for a more people-friendly agenda. This hurdle is, of course, car-centric infrastructure. During periods of growth before the 1960s, most of the Oslo area grew based around railroads or the tram network. Even in the 50s, after the war, some estates were developed based around modes of public transportation because most people didn't own a car. Like most cities, the car became an invasive species. Traffic and pollution grew, and the way that infrastructure was built reflected the need to accommodate them. This includes a system of urban highways, which included the highway that ran through Burkiva. Beginning in the 90s, Oslo had passed a series of infrastructure packages, which aimed to decrease car use in the city and its highways, and increase the public transportation usage. This was originally conceived based around toll roads for the purpose of decreasing car use. Oslo hasn't necessarily gotten rid of the highways running within the city. Instead, it's moved some of them underground. The highway which ran where the opera house is turned into a tunnel under the harbor. Another example is around Sentrum, where a highway was buried and turned into a boulevard. Walking through Oslo and talking to locals, you get the impression that things are growing quickly. People mention that the city 10 years ago was totally different. One can see buildings of all types going up all around the place. Norway does not have a huge population. As of 2022, it has around 5.5 million people. Oslo, however, has been growing quickly over the last 20 years, and now the urban area has over 1 million people in it. Looking at these trends from a North American perspective, it's hard to imagine this kind of growth being coordinated or even slightly sustainable. 60 years have passed since the suburban single-family home craze started in the US. That's 60 years of highways being built, communities being forcibly separated, and an overall unhealthy way of living being accepted, even though there's a clearly more balanced, if not outright better way to grow. Oslo, on the other hand, has met this growth by building new, mixed communities, providing multiple modes of transportation, and making the streets safer for pedestrians and cyclists. Oslo's metro system, the T-Bahn, has grown to be 5 lines, with a new one incoming that's connecting the site of the former airport that's now being redeveloped. Not to mention a relatively intact tram network that has seen growth too, and a commuter rail network that's also seeing investment and growth. The T-Bahn will soon have 6 lines and over 100 stations. The tram system has 6 lines already and 99 stops. The commuter rail has 8 lines. The city runs an extensive intercity bus line along with intracity lines too. All of this in a metro area with less than 2 million people. Oslo could very well be the city with the most extensive public transit system per resident. I think any city and its residents can learn from Oslo. It's a place that has not accepted traffic, pollution, pedestrian deaths, and alienated communities as a fact of life, and instead, it's pushing towards a balanced approach to urban living. I've included a link in the description to a website ran by a few Norwegian institutions, where you can parse through aerial photos of Oslo showing the city's change over time. I wanted to mention that I'm not Norwegian or a resident of Oslo. I'm an American passively interested in what makes cities great. I'm giving this disclaimer because this video most likely has gaps in information, or it might lack some of the nuance that comes with actually living somewhere. Nonetheless, I hope you enjoy it, and if you have any knowledge you'd like to share, please do so in the comments section.